Empty shelves at supermarkets. Long queues of grocery shoppers. These scenes have played out in Singapore and around the world as the COVID-19 pandemic led countries to shut borders, sparking fears food and raw material supplies will be affected.
The entire supply chain is affected because people can't get out to plant, the harvest, and the transport produce and so on. The person supplying the inputs like fertilizers, seeds and so on, already we're hearing that in some countries like the Philippines, the farmers are short of seeds. There's no seeds to plant. Whether we will see another food crisis will very much depend on how much longer this pandemic drags on, how much current food stocks we use up, and also whether countries, especially the exporting countries, can replenish their stocks through new plantings.
The worst-case scenario of a food crisis has been avoided so far, as countries are slowly opening up again. In Singapore, the supply of food has remained largely stable during the outbreak.
We've been preparing for the possibility of a serious food supply disruption, whether it's due to global pandemics like COVID-19 or longer-term trends such as climate change, which will impact global food supply, global population growth, which will lead to rising global food demand, which could lead to a global shortage, geopolitical developments, or other factors.
The city-state has been building resilience in its food supply chain through three main strategies. The main one is import source diversification. This means having more than one source country for each food item. So if there are supply disruptions in one country, Singapore can still fall back on other countries to supply that item.
We diversify our import sources by working with importers to organize overseas sourcing trips, business networking sessions, and we also work with the overseas countries to accredit as many farms as possible to export back to Singapore. In fact, we have increased the number of approved countries for eggs from 7 countries in 2016 to 13 countries as of May of this year, and that's nearly a doubling. Today, our food sources are diversified over 170 countries and regions.
Food security expert Professor Paul Teng says there is scope for Singapore to diversify its food sources further.
Singapore doesn't import from any country. We have our own standards, right, of production, of safety, cleanliness, and so on, And some of these countries find it difficult to meet our standards. Why don't we help them to invest, to upgrade their standards so that they can actually export to us? See, like Sarawak is a good example.
But with more than 90% of its food coming from overseas, COVID-19 has highlighted the vulnerabilities Singapore faces in the event of widespread disruption to the global food supply chain. So can local farmers step up to the plate? The Singapore Food Agency says local production currently accounts for around a quarter of egg supply, about 14% of vegetable supply, and about 10% of fish supply. In all, Singapore produces less than 10% of its nutritional needs today. The goal is to bump that up to 30% by 2030.
We're confident we can achieve it through technology, and this technology will help our local farmers to optimize production and intensify agricultural land use. For example, indoor multi-story LED lighting vegetable farms and recirculating aquaculture systems. They can produce 10 to 15 times more vegetables and more fish per hectare compared to traditional vegetable farms and traditional land-based fish farms.
Local fish farmer Aquaculture Centre of Excellence, or ACE, is already adopting technology to improve farming outcomes.
You must have a technology that is able to protect your fish from disease and able to increase its stock density within the same small capacity that you have. So therefore, ACE is harnessing the technology of increasing what we call the stock density to production, and also to increase the clean water into the tank by giving it more oxygen. We are able to have a higher production yield because we stock more fish in the tank, and then we have very low mortality.
ACE says it can produce more than 160 tons of fish per annum. That is around 20 times more than the average minimum yield of traditional farms. To support local farmers, more land will also be dedicated to farming.
We're looking to plan and redevelop the larger Lim Chu Kang area. We want to take into consideration the feedback from the farmers for centralized facilities and services to reduce the cost of production. Additionally, we are also looking to unlock more alternative spaces, which may be unconventional but nevertheless can be put to good farming use. This could include vacant interim state properties and rooftops.
Singapore is land scarce, so planners have to break new ground.
The question we should be asking ourselves is, what other unused space is there that we can use in Singapore? It's not just on land, but on sea itself, or underground. What other space, underutilized, or potentially can be utilized, should we be tapping?
But pricing and consumer buy-in remain a challenge for local producers.
Essential local produce must not go through many middlemen and make the price be more expensive. So farmers like ourselves who are local, though we produce farm to fork, we must be able to reach a top level where supermarkets don't take a big cost margin.
ACE has launched a B2C platform, ACE Fish Market, which allows consumers to buy freshly farmed fish directly from the company. As local farmers navigate the challenges they face producing at home, going overseas may be their solution.
These Singaporean companies will then be able to overcome the land and manpower constraints that they face in Singapore and also access new and bigger market opportunities overseas and eventually export back to Singapore to strengthen our food securities.
SFA says local farms have ventured into Australia, Brunei, Hong Kong, Thailand and China.